They thought she was just another easy target until they made the worst mistake of their lives and discovered her deadly secret that would change everything. Emma Rodriguez adjusted her blazer nervously as she stood outside room 204 at Lincoln High School, clutching her lesson plans against her chest. At 26, she looked younger than most of the senior students she'd be teaching, her petite 5'3" frame and soft features making her appear more like a college freshman than a biology teacher with a master's degree. Her long, dark hair was pulled back in a conservative bun, and she wore minimal makeup, hoping to project the professional authority she desperately needed to establish. This was her first real teaching position after substitute teaching for 2 years, and the weight of that responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. The hallways of Lincoln High buzzed with the chaotic energy of a Monday morning, students rushing to beat the first bell while teachers clutched their coffee cups like lifelines. Emma had spent the weekend preparing meticulously for this moment, organizing her classroom, reviewing her curriculum, and practicing her introduction in front of her bedroom mirror. She wanted everything to be perfect, needed it to be perfect, because she knew how quickly teenage students could sense weakness and exploit it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What none of these students rushing past her could possibly know was that beneath her nervous exterior lay 8 years of disciplined martial arts training. Emma held a 3rd-degree black belt in Shotokan karate, earned through countless hours of rigorous practice at the Sunset Martial Arts Academy back in her college town. She had competed nationally, winning regional championships and earning recognition for her lightning-fast combinations and devastating kicks. Her sensei, Master Williams, had often told her that she possessed a rare combination of technical precision and raw power that made her exceptionally dangerous in combat. But Emma had deliberately left that part of her life behind when she decided to become a teacher. The discipline and mental focus from her martial arts training served her well in academics, but she believed that violence had no place in an educational environment. She had made a conscious decision to handle conflicts through communication, understanding, and professional protocols. Her mother, also a teacher, had reinforced this philosophy throughout Emma's childhood, emphasizing that true strength came from restraint and wisdom, not from physical dominance. The first bell rang, jolting Emma from her thoughts. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked into her new classroom with as much confidence as she could muster. The room was typical of most high school science labs, with black-top tables arranged in rows, microscopes stored in wooden cabinets, and a periodic table hanging prominently on the wall. Large windows on the east side provided natural light, and Emma had arranged some small plants on the windowsill to make the space feel more welcoming. Students began filtering in, their conversations dying down as they noticed the unfamiliar face at the front of the room. Emma watched them carefully, trying to gauge their initial reactions. Most seemed curious but harmless, taking their seats and pulling out notebooks or phones. A few whispered among themselves, and she caught fragments of their conversations speculating about her age and experience. Then Zach Patterson walked in, and the entire dynamic of the room shifted. At 18, Zach stood 6 feet 1 inch with the broad shoulders and confident swagger of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. His blonde hair was styled with expensive product, and his green eyes held an calculating intelligence that immediately put Emma on alert. He wore his varsity football jacket despite the warm September weather, the letter prominently displayed like a badge of authority. Behind him followed his constant companions, Brad Coleman and Kyle Henderson, forming a trio that clearly commanded respect and fear from their classmates. Brad was shorter but stockier than Zach, with dark hair and a face that seemed naturally set in a sneer. He had the look of someone who enjoyed conflict for its own sake, and Emma noticed how other students automatically moved out of his way. Kyle, tall and lanky with nervous energy, seemed to participate in their group more from fear than genuine malice, his eyes darting around the room as if always expecting trouble. The three took seats in the back corner, and Emma immediately felt the shift in classroom atmosphere. Students who had been relaxed suddenly became tense, sitting straighter and avoiding eye contact with the newcomers. This was clearly an established pattern, a social hierarchy that had been in place long before Emma arrived. Emma began her introduction with practiced enthusiasm, trying to project confidence despite the intimidating presence in the back of the room. "Good morning, everyone. I'm Ms. Rodriguez, and I'll be your biology teacher this year. I know some of you might be wondering about me since I'm new to Lincoln High, so let me tell you a little about myself. I graduated from the University of Illinois with my master's degree in molecular biology, and I'm really excited to share my passion for science with all of you." She had rehearsed this speech dozens of times, but speaking it in front of actual students felt different, more vulnerable. Her voice carried a slight tremor that she hoped wasn't noticeable, and she gripped her lesson plan tighter to keep her hands from shaking. The majority of students seemed engaged, but she could feel Zach's group watching her with predatory interest, like wolves evaluating potential prey. "This year, we'll be exploring everything from cellular biology to genetics to ecology," Emma continued, moving toward the whiteboard to write out the course objectives. "I believe science is all around us, and my goal is to help you see the incredible complexity and beauty of the natural world. We'll be doing hands-on experiments, group projects, and field studies that will make these concepts come alive." As she reached up to write on the higher portion of the whiteboard, Emma heard a low whistle from the back of the room, followed by muffled laughter. She paused briefly, her marker hovering over the board before continuing with her writing. Years of martial arts training had taught her to maintain composure under pressure, and she drew on that discipline now to keep her voice steady and professional. "Now let's talk about classroom expectations," she said, turning back to face the students. "I believe in treating everyone with respect, and I expect the same in return. This is a learning environment where everyone should feel safe to ask questions, make mistakes, and grow. We're going to work together to create a positive atmosphere where science can flourish." Zach raised his hand with exaggerated politeness. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said, drawing out her name with mock formality. "How old are you exactly? You look pretty young to be teaching high school students. Some of us are 18, you know. We're practically adults." Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks, but maintained her professional demeanor. "My age isn't relevant to our studies, Zach. What matters is that I'm qualified to teach this subject and committed to helping all of you succeed. Now let's move on to our first unit on cell structure." But Zach wasn't finished. "It's just that you seem really nervous," he continued with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Are you sure you can handle a classroom full of teenagers? Some of us can be pretty challenging." The comment drew snickers from his friends and uncomfortable silence from the rest of the class. Emma recognized this as a deliberate test, an attempt to establish dominance and undermine her authority from the very first day. She had read about such tactics in her education courses, but experiencing them firsthand felt different, more personal and threatening. "I appreciate your concern, Zach," Emma replied evenly, "but I'm confident in my abilities as an educator. Now please open your textbooks to Chapter 1 so we can begin our exploration of cellular biology." For the remainder of the class period, Zach and his friends engaged in a subtle campaign of disruption. They whispered during her explanations, made exaggerated sighs of boredom, and asked deliberately obtuse questions designed to waste time and frustrate her efforts. Emma handled each incident professionally, redirecting attention back to the lesson and refusing to be drawn into confrontation. When the bell finally rang, students filed out quickly, eager to escape the tension that had filled the room. Emma noticed several sympathetic glances from some of the quieter students, including a girl named Maria Santos, who lingered near the door as if wanting to say something, before ultimately deciding against it and hurrying away. As Zach passed her desk, he stopped and leaned down slightly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Welcome to Lincoln High, Ms. Rodriguez. Hope you last longer than the last new teacher. She quit after 2 weeks." He straightened up with that same cold smile and walked out, leaving Emma alone with her racing heart and growing dread. The rest of Emma's first day followed a similar pattern. Word spread quickly through the school's social networks about the new biology teacher, and by lunchtime she could feel students watching her with curious eyes as she sat alone in the teacher's lounge. The other faculty members were polite but distant, caught up in their own preparations and responsibilities. Only Lisa Chen, a young math teacher who had started the previous year, made any real effort to be welcoming. "How was your first morning?" Lisa asked, settling into the chair across from Emma with her own lunch. "I saw you had Zach Patterson in your first period class. That's rough for a debut." Emma looked up from her sandwich, grateful for someone who seemed genuinely interested in her well-being. "It was challenging," she admitted. "He seemed determined to test boundaries right from the start. Is that typical behavior for him?" Lisa's expression grew serious. "Zach's been a problem since freshman year, but it's gotten worse since he became football captain. His dad's on the school board, which makes things complicated for administration. Last year's biology teacher, Mr. Henderson, had constant issues with him. Kyle Henderson is actually his nephew, which is probably why he runs with Zach's crowd now." The information was both helpful and discouraging. Emma had hoped that Zach's behavior was simply first-day posturing that would settle down once classroom routines were established. Learning that it was part of a long-standing pattern suggested she was facing a more serious challenge than she had anticipated. "What kind of issues did Mr. Henderson have?" Emma asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Lisa glanced around the lounge to ensure they couldn't be overheard before leaning forward. "Constant disruption, disrespectful comments, and inappropriate behavior toward female substitute teachers. There were several incidents where Zach crossed lines that should have resulted in suspension, but somehow he always managed to avoid serious consequences. Mr. Henderson finally requested a transfer to the middle school just to get away from the situation." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. The idea that an experienced teacher had been driven away by student behavior was deeply troubling, and it made her question whether she was prepared for what lay ahead. Her martial arts training had taught her to face physical challenges with confidence, but this was a different kind of battle, one where her usual tools for handling conflict were inappropriate and potentially career-ending. The afternoon brought her second encounter with Zach's group in her advanced placement biology class. This smaller class of motivated students should have been easier to manage, but Zach's presence seemed to poison the atmosphere regardless of the academic level. He had clearly positioned himself as the alpha student, and other teenagers deferred to his authority even when it contradicted Emma's instructions. "Today, we're going to examine plant cells under the microscope," Emma announced, distributing prepared slides to each lab station. "I want you to work in pairs to identify the different cellular structures we discussed yesterday. You'll need to sketch what you observe and label the organelles clearly." As students began setting up their microscopes, Emma circulated through the room, offering guidance and answering questions. Most pairs worked diligently, but she noticed that Zach and Brad were spending more time talking than focusing on their assignment. When she approached their station, they immediately fell silent, watching her with expressions that made her uncomfortable. "How's your observation coming along?" Emma asked professionally, glancing at their largely empty worksheet. "Great, Ms. Rodriguez," Zach replied with exaggerated enthusiasm. "We're just having trouble getting a good view. Maybe you could help us adjust the focus." Emma stepped closer to their microscope, bending slightly to look through the eyepiece. The slide was completely out of focus, suggesting they hadn't made any real effort to complete the assignment. As she reached for the focus knob, she became acutely aware of Zach's proximity and the way he was positioning himself to look down at her. "You need to start with the lowest magnification," she explained, adjusting the objective lens, then gradually increase the power while fine-tuning the focus. The plant cells should be clearly visible once you get the lighting right. As she demonstrated the proper technique, Emma felt Zach lean closer, ostensibly to see what she was doing, but clearly invading her personal space in a way that made her skin crawl. His cologne was overpowering, and she could sense his deliberate attempt to make her uncomfortable through inappropriate proximity. "I see it now," Zach said, his voice carrying a tone that suggested he was seeing more than just plant cells. "Thanks for the hands-on instruction, Ms. Rodriguez. You're really good at showing us things up close." Emma straightened quickly, putting distance between herself and the student while maintaining her professional composure. "Please complete your worksheet based on your observations," she said firmly. "I'll be checking your progress in 10 minutes. As she moved away from their station, Emma heard Brad make a comment that she couldn't quite catch, followed by their muffled laughter. The sound sent a warning signal through her nervous system, the same instinctive alert she had learned to recognize during sparring matches when an opponent was preparing to attack. Her martial arts training had developed her situational awareness to an extraordinary degree, and every instinct was telling her that Zach Patterson was escalating toward something dangerous. The remainder of the class period passed without further incident, but Emma noticed that several other students seemed uncomfortable with the dynamic between her and Zach's group. Maria Santos, the quiet girl from her morning class, kept glancing nervously between Emma and the troublemakers, her expression troubled. When the dismissal bell rang, Maria approached Emma's desk hesitantly. "Miss Rodriguez," she said quietly, looking around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Emma looked up from her gradebook, noting the genuine concern in the girl's dark eyes. "Of course, Maria. What's on your mind?" The student shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling with whether to speak up. "It's about Zach and his friends. They've been talking about you between classes, and some of the things they're saying aren't appropriate. I thought you should know." Emma felt her stomach tighten, but she kept her expression neutral and encouraging. "What kind of things, Maria?" Maria glanced toward the door again before continuing. "They're making comments about how you look, about your age, and about whether you'll be able to handle them. Zach said something about how easy it would be to get rid of another teacher if they wanted to. I don't think he was joking." The information confirmed Emma's growing suspicions about the seriousness of her situation. Having a student warn her about potential problems was both helpful and deeply troubling, suggesting that Zach's behavior was well known throughout the school community, but had been allowed to continue unchecked. "Thank you for telling me, Maria," Emma said sincerely. "I really appreciate your concern, and I want you to know that you can always come to me if you see or hear something that makes you uncomfortable. That goes for anything, not just issues related to me." Maria nodded, but still looked worried. "Just be careful, Ms. Rodriguez. Some of the other teachers have tried to stand up to Zach before, and it didn't end well for them. His father has a lot of influence in this town." After Maria left, Emma sat alone in her classroom, processing the events of her first day and the mounting evidence that she was facing a more serious challenge than typical teenage testing of boundaries. The empty room felt different now, less like a sanctuary and more like a battleground where she would need to prove herself capable of maintaining control and authority. She thought about her years of martial arts training, the countless hours spent perfecting techniques that could disable opponents twice her size. Master Williams had always emphasized that true martial arts wasn't about fighting, but about the confidence and discipline that made fighting unnecessary. The strongest warriors, he taught, were those who could resolve conflicts without ever throwing a punch. But as Emma gathered her materials and prepared to leave for the day, she couldn't shake the feeling that her philosophy of peaceful resolution was about to be put to its ultimate test. Zach Patterson represented a type of opponent she had never faced before, someone who operated within a system that seemed designed to protect him from consequences, while leaving his targets vulnerable and isolated. The setting sun cast long shadows across the empty hallway as Emma walked toward the exit, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and she suspected that Zach's campaign against her was just beginning. What he didn't know, what none of them could possibly imagine, was that beneath her professional exterior lay a warrior's heart and the skills to back it up. The question wasn't whether Emma could defend herself if necessary. The question was whether she would be able to maintain her principles and her career when pushed beyond her breaking point. The second week at Lincoln High brought a systematic escalation that Emma hadn't anticipated. What started as classroom disruptions evolved into a calculated campaign designed to undermine her authority and push her toward a breaking point. Zach Patterson had clearly decided that the new biology teacher represented a challenge to his established dominance, and he was methodically working to eliminate that threat. Tuesday morning began with Emma discovering that someone had tampered with her classroom supplies. The microscope lenses had been smeared with what appeared to be petroleum jelly, rendering them useless for the day's lab exercise. Her carefully prepared plant specimens had been contaminated with salt water, killing the samples she had spent hours cultivating. Most troubling of all, someone had accessed her computer and changed her lesson plan documents, inserting crude jokes and inappropriate comments throughout her professional materials. Emma stared at her vandalized preparations, feeling a familiar surge of controlled anger that she hadn't experienced since her competitive fighting days. The deliberate nature of the sabotage spoke to careful planning and intimate knowledge of her teaching schedule. This wasn't random teenage mischief, but a targeted attack designed to make her appear incompetent and unprepared in front of her students. Lisa Chen found her standing motionless in front of her ruined materials 20 minutes before first period. "Emma, what happened here?" she asked, taking in the scope of the damage with widening eyes. "Someone decided to welcome me properly to Lincoln High," Emma replied, her voice tightly controlled. She had learned long ago that revealing emotional responses only encouraged bullies to escalate their behavior. Her sensei had taught her that anger was a tool to be channeled, not a weakness to be displayed. "This is way beyond normal pranks," Lisa said, pulling out her phone. "We need to report this to Principal Morrison immediately. There are security cameras in the hallways that might have caught whoever did this." Emma considered the suggestion but shook her head slowly. The cameras only cover the main corridors, not individual classrooms. Besides, I doubt we'd find any useful footage. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing and when to do it. The truth was more complex than Emma wanted to admit to her colleague. She suspected strongly that Zach was behind the vandalism, but proving it would be nearly impossible. More importantly, she recognized this as an escalation tactic designed to provoke her into making accusations she couldn't substantiate. Responding emotionally would only demonstrate that his strategy was working. Instead, Emma spent her planning period improvising alternative activities for her classes, drawing on her extensive preparation to create engaging lessons that didn't require the compromised materials. When students arrived to find her calmly presenting modified experiments, they seemed almost disappointed by her composed reaction to what should have been a professional disaster. Zach entered first period with an expression of anticipation that quickly shifted to frustration when he realized his sabotage hadn't achieved its intended effect. Rather than appearing flustered or incompetent, Emma had adapted seamlessly, turning the setback into an opportunity to demonstrate scientific problem-solving in real time. "Looks like we're doing something different today," Zach commented with false innocence as he took his seat. "Equipment problems, Ms. Rodriguez." Emma met his gaze steadily, recognizing the probing question for what it was. "Sometimes the best science happens when we have to adapt our methods, Zach. Real researchers learn to be flexible when unexpected challenges arise. Today's improvisation will actually give you better insights into experimental design than following a predetermined protocol." Her response clearly wasn't what he had expected. The subtle acknowledgement that she knew something had happened, combined with her refusal to be rattled by it, sent a message that Emma Rodriguez was not going to be as easy to break as her predecessor. The lesson proceeded smoothly, with most students engaging enthusiastically with the modified activities. Emma noticed several students glancing between her and Zach, sensing the underlying tension, but unable to fully understand its source. Maria Santos seemed particularly attentive, her dark eyes moving constantly between Emma and the troublemakers, as if anticipating some kind of confrontation. During the lunch period, Emma made her way to the teacher's lounge, hoping for a few minutes of peace to regroup and plan her afternoon classes. The small room was nearly empty, except for Coach Dan Mitchell, a heavy-set man in his 50s who taught physical education and served as the football team's defensive coordinator. His presence made Emma uncomfortable, knowing his close relationship with the athletic program that protected players like Zach from meaningful consequences. "Heard you had some trouble in your classroom this morning," Coach Mitchell said, without looking up from his newspaper. "These kids can be real pranksters sometimes. Best not to take it too personally." Emma poured herself coffee, noting the dismissive tone that suggested he had already decided the incident was insignificant. "Someone destroyed hours of preparation and expensive scientific materials, Coach. That goes well beyond harmless pranks." Coach Mitchell shrugged, still not making eye contact. Kids will be kids, especially the athletes. They've got a lot of energy and competitive spirit. Sometimes it comes out in ways that seem problematic, but it's really just high-spirited behavior. You'll learn to roll with it once you've been here longer. The casual dismissal of deliberate sabotage as high-spirited behavior revealed everything Emma needed to know about the institutional culture that had allowed Zach's behavior to escalate unchecked. This wasn't ignorance, but willful blindness, a systematic choice to protect certain students at the expense of educational standards and teacher welfare. "I've been teaching for several years, Coach," Emma replied evenly. "I know the difference between energetic students and deliberate harassment. What happened in my classroom was calculated vandalism that interfered with the education of every student in my classes." Coach Mitchell finally looked up, his expression hardening slightly. "You know, Ms. Rodriguez, sometimes new teachers come in thinking they need to shake things up, challenge the established order that rarely works out well. The kids who've been here for years have earned certain privileges through their contributions to the school community. Football players especially deserve some consideration for the pride and recognition they bring to Lincoln High." Emma felt her jaw clench involuntarily, a reaction she hadn't experienced since her last tournament fight 3 years earlier. So, Coach was essentially telling her that athletic achievement granted immunity from normal behavioral expectations, that her role as an educator was secondary to protecting the football program's star players. Every student deserves an equal opportunity to learn in a safe and respectful environment, she said, her voice carrying an edge of steel that made Coach Mitchell blink in surprise. Athletic ability doesn't excuse harassment or vandalism, and I won't tolerate behavior that interferes with education, regardless of who's responsible. The coach's face flushed red, and Emma could see him struggling with whether to escalate the confrontation. Years of dealing with respectful deference from the faculty had clearly not prepared him for direct challenge to his authority. Before he could formulate a response, the bell rang, ending the lunch period and giving both of them an excuse to disengage from the increasingly tense conversation. Emma's afternoon classes proceeded without major incident, but she could feel the pressure building like atmospheric changes before a storm. Students whispered more frequently, their conversations stopping abruptly when she approached. Several times, she caught groups of teenagers staring at her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to anticipation, as if they were waiting for something significant to happen. The breaking point came during her final class of the day, Advanced Placement Biology, with the school's most academically motivated students. Emma had always found AP classes easier to manage because the students were generally more focused on learning and less interested in disruptive behavior. This group represented her best chance to establish positive relationships and demonstrate her teaching abilities without constant interference. Zach Patterson wasn't supposed to be in advanced placement biology. His grades and test scores didn't meet the prerequisites, and his previous science teachers had consistently rated his performance as below average. However, his father's position on the school board had apparently overcome such trivial concerns as academic qualification. Today, we're going to explore enzyme kinetics through a series of controlled experiments, Emma announced, distributing detailed laboratory protocols to each student pair. This is college-level work that will require precision, careful observation, and rigorous data analysis. I expect everyone to demonstrate the maturity and focus that AP coursework demands. The majority of students immediately began reading through the procedures and organizing their materials, but Zach and Brad made no effort to engage with the assignment. Instead, they positioned themselves at a lab station near the back of the room where they could observe Emma without being easily monitored themselves. As Emma circulated through the classroom, helping students set up their experiments and explaining complex concepts, she became increasingly aware of Zach's fixed attention. Unlike his usual disruptive commentary, he was watching her silently, his green eyes tracking her movements with predatory focus that made her skin crawl. The turning point came when Emma reached up to retrieve a reference chart from the high storage cabinet above the demonstration table. The movement required her to stretch significantly, and she was acutely conscious of maintaining professional modesty while accessing the teaching materials she needed. From across the room, she heard the distinctive sound of a smartphone camera, taking multiple photos in rapid succession. Emma's head snapped around to see Zach holding his phone at an angle that could only be intended to capture inappropriate images. Several students had noticed as well, their faces showing mixtures of shock and embarrassment at witnessing such blatant harassment. The classroom fell into absolute silence, 24 students holding their collective breath as they waited to see how their new teacher would respond to this unprecedented violation. Emma felt time slow around her, the same sensation she had experienced in tournament finals when critical decisions had to be made in split-second timing. Her martial arts training had taught her to control her immediate emotional responses, to channel adrenaline into focused action rather than reactive anger. Every instinct screamed at her to confront Zach directly, to use her physical advantages to teach him a lesson about respecting women. But her professional responsibilities demanded a different approach, one that preserved her career while still addressing the unacceptable behavior. Zach, Emma said quietly, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room despite its low volume. "Put your phone away immediately and come see me after class. The rest of you, please continue with your experiments." Zach's face broke into a triumphant grin, clearly interpreting her restrained response as weakness rather than professionalism. He made a show of slowly putting his phone into his pocket, taking his time to demonstrate that he was complying with her request as a favor rather than acknowledging her authority. "Actually, Ms. Rodriguez," he said with mock politeness, "I think there might be some confusion about what you think you saw. I was just checking my messages like everyone else does. Maybe you're feeling a little paranoid because you're still adjusting to your new job." The calculated response was designed to gaslight her, to make her question her own perceptions, while positioning him as the reasonable party in the interaction. Emma recognized the tactic immediately, having seen similar psychological manipulation during her years of competitive fighting when opponents tried to get inside her head before matches. Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly recognizing that something significant was happening, but uncertain how to respond. Maria Santos looked particularly distressed, her hands clenched into fists as she watched the confrontation unfold. Emma walked slowly toward Zach's lab station, her movements deliberate and controlled. Years of sparring had taught her how to use proximity and body language to project confidence without appearing threatening. She stopped just outside his personal space, close enough to speak quietly, but far enough away to avoid any accusations of inappropriate contact. "Zach," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying absolute certainty, "I know exactly what I saw, and you know exactly what you did. This behavior stops now, or there will be consequences that extend far beyond this classroom. Do I make myself clear?" For the first time since she had met him, Emma saw genuine uncertainty flicker across Zach's face. Her tone carried an authority that transcended her role as a teacher, something deeper and more dangerous than academic discipline. The change was subtle but unmistakable, a shift in the power dynamic that several observant students noticed immediately. Brad leaned forward from his seat, apparently sensing that his friend needed support. "Hey, you can't talk to him like that. We haven't done anything wrong, and you're acting like some kind of crazy person." Emma turned her attention to Brad without moving from her position near Zach, her dark eyes fixing on him with laser intensity. The look was one she had perfected during tournament competition, a gaze that communicated absolute confidence in her ability to handle whatever challenge might arise. "Brad," she said calmly, "I suggest you focus on your own behavior rather than defending actions you weren't involved in. Anyone who wants to succeed in this class needs to demonstrate respect for the learning environment and for everyone in it." The implicit threat was clear enough to make Brad sink back into his chair, but Emma could see that the confrontation was far from over. Zach's expression had hardened into something approaching hatred, his initial surprise replaced by cold calculation. She had challenged his authority publicly, something that apparently no teacher had dared to do before. The remainder of the class period passed in tense silence, with students working diligently on their experiments while stealing glances at the ongoing psychological battle between their teacher and the school's most powerful student. Emma continued her rounds, helping with procedures and answering questions as if nothing had happened, but every person in the room could feel the electric tension crackling between her and Zach. When the dismissal bell finally rang, most students packed their materials quickly and hurried toward the exit, clearly eager to escape the uncomfortable atmosphere. Zach, however, made no move to leave, instead lounging back in his chair with exaggerated casualness, while Brad hovered nearby uncertainly. "You wanted to see me after class, Ms. Rodriguez," Zach said with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Here, I am. What exactly did you want to discuss?" Emma waited until the last of the other students had left before responding, ensuring that their conversation would be private, but positioning herself near the open door for both safety and propriety. The empty classroom felt different now, charged with potential violence that she could sense but not yet see. What I want to discuss, Zach, is your complete lack of respect for appropriate boundaries and your deliberate attempt to create a hostile learning environment, Emma said, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of steel. Taking unauthorized photographs of your teacher is sexual harassment, and it won't be tolerated under any circumstances. Zach's smirk widened, and Emma realized that her direct confrontation was exactly what he had been hoping for. You're going to have a hard time proving that, Ms. Rodriguez. My phone is password protected, and even if you could access it, which you can't, you'd have to explain why you were paranoid enough to think I was taking pictures of you in the first place. The response revealed careful planning and an understanding of how difficult such accusations were to substantiate. Emma recognized that she was dealing with someone who had experience manipulating systems designed to protect students, turning those protections into weapons against the adults trying to maintain order. Whether or not I can prove what happened today is less important than what happens moving forward, Emma replied. You've made your intentions clear, and I've made my expectations clear. The choice of how this situation develops is entirely yours. Zach stood slowly, using his height advantage to loom over Emma in a way clearly designed to intimidate. At 6 feet 1 inch, he towered over her petite frame, and his athletic build made the physical disparity even more pronounced. Most teachers would have been cowed by such an obvious attempt at physical intimidation, but Emma's years of facing larger opponents had taught her that size meant nothing without skill and training. You know what I think, Ms. Rodriguez? Zach said, stepping closer until he was clearly violating her personal space. I think you're in over your head here. I think you don't understand how things work at Lincoln High, and I think you're going to learn some hard lessons about what happens to teachers who don't know their place. The threat was explicit enough to cross legal lines, but Emma recognized that responding with her own threats would only escalate the situation toward violence. Instead, she stood her ground without retreating, her martial arts training allowing her to remain calm and centered despite the obvious intimidation attempt. I understand exactly how things work here, Zach, she said quietly. The question is whether you understand how things are going to change. This conversation is over. I suggest you think very carefully about your next actions, because they will have consequences you might not be prepared for. Zach's face flushed with anger at her refusal to back down, but before he could formulate a response, the sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway interrupted the confrontation. He stepped back quickly, not wanting to be caught in a compromising position by another faculty member. This isn't over, Ms. Rodriguez, he said quietly as he gathered his backpack. Not even close. Emma watched him leave, noting the deliberate swagger in his walk that was designed to project confidence despite his obvious frustration at her unexpected resistance. Once he was gone, she sank into her desk chair, finally allowing herself to process the full implications of what had just occurred. The gloves were officially off now. Zach Patterson had revealed his true intentions, and Emma had drawn a line in the sand that neither of them could cross without consequences. She thought about her years of martial arts training, the discipline and control that had shaped her into someone capable of defending herself against any physical threat. But this wasn't a tournament with clear rules and impartial referees. This was a war of attrition, where her opponent held most of the institutional advantages and seemed willing to use any tactic necessary to achieve victory. Emma Rodriguez had faced dangerous opponents before, but none quite like this. As she gathered her materials and prepared to leave for the day, Emma found herself mentally reviewing defensive techniques and tactical principles that she hadn't considered in years. Her sensei had always taught that the best warriors were those who could end conflicts without fighting, but he had also emphasized that sometimes violence was the only language certain people understood. The question wasn't whether Emma had the skills to protect herself. The question was whether she would be able to maintain her principles and her career when Zach Patterson inevitably pushed the situation beyond the point where peaceful resolution was possible. Thursday morning brought news that made Emma's blood run cold. Maria Santos approached her before first period with tears in her eyes and a story that confirmed Emma's worst fears about the escalating situation. "Ms. Rodriguez," Maria said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard, "something happened yesterday after school that I think you need to know about." Emma set down her lesson plans and gave Maria her full attention, recognizing the courage it took for a student to report on popular athletes. "What happened, Maria?" "Zach and his friends were in the parking lot talking about you," Maria continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "They were saying really inappropriate things about your appearance and making plans for something they called Operation Teacher Takedown. Brad was laughing about how easy it would be to get you fired if they could just push you into doing something stupid." The information was both valuable and terrifying, confirming that Emma was facing an organized campaign rather than random teenage rebellion. The fact that they were actively strategizing her removal suggested a level of calculation that went far beyond normal boundary testing. "Did they say anything specific about their plans?" Emma asked, trying to keep her voice neutral despite the fear and anger churning in her stomach. Maria nodded reluctantly. "They mentioned something about video recording and making sure whatever they did would look like your fault instead of theirs. Zach said something about how the last teacher fell for the same trap and was gone within a week of making the wrong move." Emma felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Her predecessor's sudden departure, the institutional reluctance to address Zach's behavior, the careful timing of yesterday's confrontation, all of it pointed to a systematic approach that had apparently been successful before. "Thank you for telling me this, Maria," Emma said sincerely. "I know it wasn't easy to come forward, and I want you to know that I'll do everything I can to protect your privacy. But I also need you to understand that things might get more difficult before they get better." Maria nodded, her expression showing both fear and determination. "Some of us are tired of watching Zach and his friends get away with everything, while good teachers leave because of them. Maybe it's time someone finally stood up to him properly." The comment revealed that Emma wasn't as isolated as she had felt. There were students who recognized the toxic dynamic and were willing to support change, even if they couldn't challenge the bullies directly themselves. This knowledge gave her strength, but also increased the pressure to handle the situation correctly. First period proceeded normally, with Zach apparently deciding to adopt a wait-and-see approach rather than immediate escalation. He participated minimally in class activities, but avoided overt disruption, watching Emma with calculating eyes that made her skin crawl. The calm felt ominous rather than reassuring, like the stillness before a violent storm. The attack came during her lunch break when Emma least expected it. She had decided to eat in her classroom rather than face the increasingly uncomfortable atmosphere in the teacher's lounge. The small meal she had packed seemed tasteless as she graded papers and tried to prepare mentally for the afternoon's challenges. The quiet was almost peaceful after days of constant tension and vigilance. A soft knock on her classroom door interrupted her thoughts. Emma looked up to see Kyle Henderson standing in the doorway, his lanky frame and nervous expression making him appear younger than his 17 years. Unlike his more aggressive companions, Kyle had always seemed uncomfortable with the group's worst behavior, participating more from fear than genuine malice. "Ms. Rodriguez," Kyle said hesitantly, "can I talk to you for a minute? It's about the biology assignment from yesterday. I'm having trouble understanding the enzyme kinetics calculations. Emma gestured for him to come in, grateful for what seemed like a genuine academic interaction for the first time in days. "Of course, Kyle. I'm happy to help you work through the problems. Enzyme kinetics can be challenging until you understand the underlying principles." Kyle approached her desk slowly, pulling out his notebook and sitting in the chair beside her desk. His questions seemed legitimate, focusing on mathematical concepts that many students found difficult. Emma found herself relaxing slightly as she explained the material, grateful for a normal teaching interaction that reminded her why she had chosen this profession. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Kyle asking thoughtful follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine interest in understanding the material. Emma was impressed by his engagement, wondering if perhaps she had misjudged his character based on his association with Zach's group. It was only when Kyle accidentally knocked his pencil off the desk that Emma realized something was wrong. As he bent to retrieve it, she caught a glimpse of his phone screen and realized he had been recording their entire conversation. The device was positioned to capture both audio and video of their interaction, with the camera angle carefully chosen to create implications that didn't match reality. Emma's blood turned to ice as she understood the trap that had been set for her. An isolated meeting with a male student, recorded secretly and edited to remove context, could easily be manipulated to suggest inappropriate behavior. The recording would show her leaning close to Kyle, speaking in low tones, and displaying the kind of individual attention that could be misconstrued by administrators looking for reasons to terminate a problematic teacher. "Kyle," she said quietly, maintaining her composure despite the rage building in her chest, "please turn off your phone and hand it to me." Kyle's face went pale as he realized his covert recording had been discovered. He fumbled with the device, clearly panicking as his carefully planned deception fell apart. "I don't know what you're talking about, Ms. Rodriguez. I was just taking notes on my phone while you explained the concepts." The lie was transparent and desperate, confirming Emma's worst suspicions about the sophisticated nature of the campaign against her. This wasn't random harassment, but a carefully orchestrated attempt to create grounds for her termination through manufactured evidence of misconduct. "Stand up slowly and place your phone on my desk," Emma said, her voice carrying an authority that made Kyle's hands shake as he hesitated. "Then you're going to explain exactly who put you up to this and what they promised you in exchange for your cooperation." Kyle clutched his phone tighter, clearly torn between fear of Emma and fear of disappointing his more powerful friends. "You can't make me give you my phone. That's like illegal search and seizure or something. I have rights as a student." Emma stood from her chair, her movement controlled but carrying an unmistakable sense of contained violence that made Kyle take an involuntary step backward. The small action revealed more about her true nature than hours of classroom observation could have, hinting at capabilities that had nothing to do with lesson plans or grading rubrics. "Kyle," she said softly, "you have exactly 5 seconds to make a choice that will determine whether this situation ends quietly or becomes something much more serious than you're prepared to handle." The threat was implicit but unmistakable, carried in her tone and body language rather than explicit words. Kyle's eyes widened as he suddenly understood that he might have seriously underestimated the woman he was trying to manipulate. His hand trembled as he looked toward the door, clearly calculating whether he could escape before she could stop him. Before he could make that decision, the sound of approaching voices in the hallway provided an interruption that changed everything. Kyle immediately straightened his posture and raised his voice, transforming from nervous conspirator to apparent victim in a matter of seconds. "Ms. Rodriguez, I really don't feel comfortable with you standing so close to me," he said loudly enough to be heard by anyone passing in the corridor. "I just came here to ask about homework, and now you're acting really weird and demanding to see my personal phone." Emma realized with crystalline clarity that she was being expertly manipulated by someone who had clearly practiced this performance before. Kyle's sudden transformation from nervous student to apparent victim was too smooth to be improvised, suggesting careful coaching by someone with experience in creating such scenarios. The voices in the hallway grew closer, and Emma could hear the distinctive sound of Principal Morrison's heels clicking against the linoleum floor. In seconds, the administrator would arrive to find what appeared to be a teacher intimidating a student in an isolated classroom, with Kyle's phone potentially containing edited evidence to support whatever story Zach's group had prepared. Emma faced a critical decision point that would determine the trajectory of everything that followed. She could attempt to explain the situation truthfully, knowing that her word against a student's recording would likely be insufficient to save her career. She could confiscate Kyle's phone by force, which would certainly result in assault charges, regardless of the circumstances, or she could allow the carefully orchestrated trap to spring and hope that somehow the truth would emerge during the investigation that would inevitably follow. In that moment of perfect clarity, Emma Rodriguez made a choice that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of reacting with anger or desperation, she smiled calmly and took a step back from Kyle, her hands visible and her posture completely non-threatening. "You're absolutely right, Kyle," she said in a normal speaking voice. "I apologize if I made you uncomfortable. Why don't you take your phone and head to your next class? If you have questions about the homework later, you can ask them when other students are present." Kyle's face registered confusion and disappointment as his carefully planned performance fell flat. He had clearly expected her to panic or become aggressive, providing the dramatic confrontation that would justify whatever story he was supposed to tell. Emma's calm professionalism left him without a script to follow. Principal Morrison appeared in the doorway, just as Kyle was reluctantly pocketing his phone, her expression showing the mild concern of an administrator checking on routine classroom activities rather than the alarm of someone responding to an emergency. "Is everything all right here?" Principal Morrison asked, her eyes moving between Emma and Kyle as she assessed the situation. "Everything's fine, Principal Morrison," Emma replied with professional courtesy. "Kyle stopped by to ask some questions about yesterday's assignment, and I was just encouraging him to seek help when he needs it." Kyle stood frozen for a moment, clearly struggling with whether to proceed with his planned accusations in the face of Emma's unexpected response. The lack of drama or evidence of misconduct made his position awkward, and he seemed uncertain how to proceed without appearing to be the aggressor himself. "Well, that's good to hear," Principal Morrison said, though Emma detected a note of suspicion in her voice. "Kyle, you should probably head to your next class now. The lunch period is almost over." Kyle nodded quickly and hurried toward the door, shooting a confused glance back at Emma as he left. Emma could see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to figure out how to explain to Zach that their carefully planned trap had failed to produce the desired results. "Ms. Rodriguez," Principal Morrison said once Kyle was gone, "I hope you're settling in well here at Lincoln High. I know the adjustment to a new school can be challenging, especially for someone as young as yourself." The comment carried subtle implications about Emma's youth and inexperience, but she chose to interpret it charitably rather than defensively. "Thank you, Principal Morrison. I'm enjoying the opportunity to work with Lincoln High's students and contribute to their scientific education." Principal Morrison nodded, but Emma could see her processing the dynamics she had observed, trying to understand what had really been happening in the classroom. The administrator's next words confirmed Emma's suspicions about the broader institutional issues she was facing. "I should mention that we've had some concerns raised about your classroom management techniques," Principal Morrison said carefully. "Nothing specific, you understand, but some feedback suggesting that you might be taking a more confrontational approach than necessary with certain students." Emma felt her jaw tighten involuntarily as she realized that Zach's campaign had already reached the administrative level. The accusations were vague enough to be difficult to address directly, but serious enough to create doubt about her professional incompetence. "I'd be interested to hear more specifics about those concerns, Principal Morrison," Emma said evenly. "I believe in maintaining high standards for all students while treating everyone with respect and fairness." Principal Morrison shifted uncomfortably, clearly reluctant to provide details that might be challenged or disproven. "It's nothing we can't work through with some adjustment and communication. Perhaps you might consider being a bit more flexible in your expectations, especially with our student athletes who have additional pressures and responsibilities." Emma recognized the coded language immediately. She was being told to give special treatment to players like Zach, to allow their athletic status to excuse behavior that would be unacceptable from other students. The suggestion violated every principle of educational equity she believed in. "I believe all students benefit from consistent expectations and clear boundaries, Principal Morrison," Emma replied carefully. "Research shows that high standards actually help students develop the discipline and work ethic that serve them well in athletics and beyond." Principal Morrison's expression tightened slightly, suggesting that Emma's diplomatic refusal to lower her standards had been noted and would likely be remembered. "Well, I'm sure you'll find the right balance as you gain more experience here. In the meantime, please don't hesitate to reach out if you need any guidance or support." After the principal left, Emma sat alone in her classroom, processing the implications of everything that had just occurred. Kyle's recording attempt, Principal Morrison's coded warnings, and the systematic nature of the campaign against her all pointed to a level of organization and institutional support that made her situation far more precarious than she had initially realized. She thought about her martial arts training, about the years spent learning to remain calm under pressure and make strategic decisions in the face of overwhelming odds. Her sensei had always taught that the most dangerous opponents were those who attacked indirectly, using systems and allies rather than relying solely on their own strength. Emma Rodriguez was facing exactly that type of opponent in Zach Patterson, and she was beginning to understand that traditional professional responses might not be sufficient to handle the threat he represented. The question was whether she had the courage to use all the tools at her disposal when the inevitable confrontation finally came. Friday arrived like the calm before a hurricane, with an eerie stillness that made Emma's nerves sing with anticipation. She had spent the previous evening researching her legal options and reviewing security footage policies, trying to understand exactly what protections existed for teachers facing systematic harassment. The results were discouraging but not entirely hopeless, provided she could document incidents properly and avoid giving her opponents any ammunition to use against her. The morning brought an unexpected ally in the form of Dr. Sarah Chen, Lisa's older sister, who worked as a counselor at the school. Dr. Chen had requested a private meeting before classes began, and Emma found herself sitting across from a woman whose calm professionalism radiated competence and understanding. "Lisa told me about some of the challenges you've been facing," Dr. Chen said without preamble. "I want you to know that you're not alone in this situation, and there are resources available that might help you navigate what's clearly becoming a difficult dynamic." Emma appreciated the direct approach, though she remained cautious about revealing too much to someone she barely knew. The institutional pressure to protect student athletes was strong enough that even well-intentioned staff members might feel obligated to discourage complaints that could damage the school's reputation. "I'm managing the situation professionally," Emma replied carefully. "Every teacher faces some degree of testing from students, especially when they're new to a school environment." Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly, her expression showing both understanding and concern. "Emma, I've been working in this district for 8 years, and I've seen what happened to your predecessor and 2 other teachers before him. What you're experiencing isn't normal classroom management challenges, it's systematic harassment designed to force your resignation." The validation was both reassuring and terrifying, confirming Emma's worst fears while also providing evidence that she wasn't overreacting to normal teenage behavior. Knowing that other educators had faced similar campaigns offered some comfort, but learning that those campaigns had been successful was deeply troubling. "What exactly happened to Mr. Henderson?" Emma asked, referring to her predecessor whose sudden departure had created the opening she now filled. Dr. Chen glanced toward the door before responding, clearly ensuring their conversation couldn't be overheard by passing staff members. He lasted 3 months before requesting a transfer to the middle school. The official reason was a desire to work with younger students, but the reality was that he couldn't handle the constant psychological pressure and administrative indifference. She paused, seeming to weigh how much detail to provide. The breaking point came when someone planted inappropriate materials in his classroom computer and then reported him for possessing them. Even though the investigation cleared him completely, the damage to his reputation and confidence was irreversible. Emma felt ice form in her stomach as she realized the sophistication of the tactics being used against teachers who refused to accommodate Zach's behavior. Planting evidence was a criminal act that went far beyond teenage pranks, suggesting adult planning or at least adult-level strategic thinking. "How is something like that possible?" Emma asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. School computers are supposed to have security protocols and monitoring systems. Dr. Chen's expression darkened. "That's where things get complicated. The materials were discovered during a routine maintenance check by the IT department, but there were no digital fingerprints showing how they got there. The investigation revealed that several students had legitimate access to Mr. Henderson's classroom during study periods and after-school activities." Emma understood immediately. Zach's group had used their privileges as student athletes to gain access when the room was unmonitored, planted the evidence, and then ensured its discovery through an anonymous tip. The plan demonstrated patience, technical knowledge, and an understanding of institutional procedures that was genuinely frightening. "What kind of evidence are we talking about?" Emma asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Dr. Chen hesitated before responding. "Images that could be interpreted as inappropriate, though nothing explicitly illegal. The kind of material that creates suspicion and requires investigation even when there's no evidence of actual wrongdoing. Mr. Henderson was technically cleared, but the psychological damage was severe enough that he couldn't continue working here." Emma realized she was facing opponents who understood exactly how to weaponize the systems designed to protect students against the adults trying to educate them. The strategy was diabolical in its effectiveness, using institutional safeguards as weapons while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement. "Is there any way to protect against that kind of attack?" Emma asked, trying to keep desperation out of her voice. Dr. Chen nodded slowly. "Documentation is crucial, and you need witnesses whenever possible. Never be alone with male students, especially those in Zach's group. Keep detailed records of every interaction, no matter how minor it seems. And most importantly, don't let them provoke you into actions that can be misinterpreted or taken out of context." The advice was practical, but also deeply depressing, requiring Emma to fundamentally alter her teaching approach to accommodate the threat posed by her own students. The idea that she couldn't trust teenagers enough to help them individually was antithetical to everything she believed about education. "There's something else you should know," Dr. Chen continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "This isn't just about student behavior. There are adults in this building who benefit from maintaining the current system, people whose positions depend on athletic success and the revenue it generates for the district. Emma understood the implication immediately. Fighting Zach Patterson meant fighting an entire network of enablers who had invested interests in protecting him. The scope of the challenge was far greater than she had initially realized, extending beyond classroom management into institutional politics and financial pressures. "What advice would you give someone in my position?" Emma asked, though she suspected there were no easy answers to her dilemma. Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her words carefully. "Officially, I'd tell you to follow proper channels, document everything, and trust the system to protect you. Unofficially, I'd say that sometimes the system is broken, and people have to protect themselves in ways that go beyond official protocols." The statement was ambiguous enough to provide plausible deniability, while still conveying a clear message. Emma was being told that she might need to take matters into her own hands if she wanted to survive the campaign against her. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway, forcing both women to quickly transition to more neutral topics. Dr. Chen handed Emma a business card with her direct number and a meaningful look that suggested she would be available for consultation regardless of official channels. Emma's first period class proceeded normally, with Zach apparently deciding to maintain his wait and see approach rather than immediate escalation. However, she noticed several new dynamics that suggested the campaign against her was entering a different phase. Students seemed more divided than before, with clear factions emerging between those who supported her efforts to maintain standards and those who resented her refusal to accommodate athletic privilege. Maria Santos had recruited several other academically focused students who began sitting closer to the front of the classroom, creating a buffer zone between Emma and the troublemakers. Their body language suggested they were prepared to serve as witnesses if anything inappropriate occurred, a development that both touched and worried Emma. The real test came during her advanced placement class, where the carefully controlled environment provided cover for more sophisticated harassment techniques. Zach had apparently decided that direct confrontation was less effective than psychological manipulation, shifting to tactics designed to undermine her confidence and professional competence. Today we're going to examine protein synthesis through molecular modeling, Emma announced, distributing complex three-dimensional puzzles that required students to construct accurate representations of cellular processes. This exercise will help you visualize how genetic information is translated into functional proteins. As students began working with their modeling kits, Emma circulated through the room providing guidance and answering questions. The activity required significant individual attention, as the concepts were genuinely challenging and the physical models could be assembled incorrectly in multiple ways. When she reached Zach's lab station, she found him and Brad working together on a model. That was completely wrong, with protein chains twisted into configurations that violated basic chemical principles. Rather than asking for help, they seemed content to continue with their incorrect assembly, creating a situation where Emma had to choose between allowing them to fail or providing the individual instruction they clearly needed. "It looks like you're having some trouble with the protein folding sequence," Emma said professionally, maintaining appropriate distance while indicating the errors in their model. "The amino acid chains need to follow specific patterns based on their chemical properties." Zach looked up with an expression of exaggerated confusion. "I'm sorry, Ms. Rodriguez, but I'm having trouble understanding what you're trying to explain. Could you show me exactly what you mean by getting closer and pointing out the specific parts that are wrong?" The request seemed reasonable on the surface, but Emma recognized it as another trap designed to create opportunities for misinterpretation. Getting physically closer to male students, especially those known to be recording interactions secretly, would provide exactly the kind of compromising footage that could be edited to suggest inappropriate behavior. I'll demonstrate the correct folding pattern on the board where everyone can see it, Emma replied, moving toward the front of the classroom. The principles apply to all the models, so this explanation will benefit everyone working on the exercise. Her refusal to take the bait clearly frustrated Zach, who had been expecting her to fall into the same trap that had apparently worked against previous teachers. His expression hardened slightly as he realized she was becoming more difficult to manipulate, requiring more sophisticated tactics. "Actually, Ms. Rodriguez," Brad interjected, "I think we'd learn better with individual help. Some of us are more hands-on learners who need personal attention to really understand complex concepts like this." Emma recognized the coordinated nature of their approach, with Brad providing backup when Zach's initial attempt failed. They were working from a playbook that had clearly been successful before, adjusting their tactics when she didn't respond, as expected. "I understand that different students have different learning styles," Emma replied calmly, "but individual instruction will be provided during designated office hours when other students and faculty are present. For now, please pay attention to the demonstration I'm about to provide." As she began explaining protein folding principles on the whiteboard, Emma became aware that several students were recording her presentation with their phones. While this wasn't necessarily problematic, the timing suggested coordination with Zach's group, potentially creating a comprehensive record of her teaching methods that could be analyzed for weaknesses or edited to create misleading impressions. The situation escalated when Kyle Henderson raised his hand with what appeared to be a legitimate question about enzyme kinetics, but quickly revealed itself as another attempt to create compromising circumstances. "Ms. Rodriguez," Kyle said with apparent sincerity, "I'm still confused about the calculations we did yesterday. Could you look at my notebook and show me where I went wrong with the mathematical formulations?" Emma approached Kyle's desk cautiously, noting that his notebook was positioned in a way that would require her to lean over him significantly to examine his work. The setup was obviously designed to create an inappropriate appearance, especially if recorded from certain angles by strategically positioned phones. "Kyle, I can see your calculations from here," Emma said, maintaining her distance while pointing toward his notebook. "The error is in step 3, where you've misapplied the Michaelis-Menten equation. You need to use the correct substrate concentration values." Kyle's face showed disappointment as his trap failed to work, but he quickly adapted with a follow-up attempt. "But I can't see what you're pointing at from this angle," he said with feigned frustration. "If you could just lean down a little bit and show me exactly what numbers you're talking about, I think I'd understand much better." Emma realized she was facing a coordinated effort involving multiple students, each trained to create specific types of compromising situations that could be documented and used against her. The sophistication of their approach suggested extensive coaching by someone with detailed knowledge of how teachers could be manipulated and discredited. "Kyle, bring your notebook to my desk and I'll review your calculations there," Emma said firmly. "That way you can see the corrections clearly while I maintain appropriate professional boundaries." The response clearly wasn't what Kyle had expected, and Emma could see him glancing towards Zach for guidance on how to proceed. The brief exchange of looks confirmed her suspicions about the coordinated nature of their harassment campaign. "I don't really want to move my stuff," Kyle said with sudden petulance. "Can't you just help me here like a normal teacher would?" The comment was designed to make Emma appear unreasonable for maintaining professional distance, creating a narrative where her caution could be portrayed as evidence of inappropriate thoughts or suspicious behavior. The psychological manipulation was expertly crafted to put her in a no-win situation. "Kyle," Emma said with calm authority, "you have two choices. You can bring your work to my desk for review, Or you can wait until office hours next week when individual help is available. What you cannot do is dictate the circumstances under which I provide instruction." The firmness of her response seemed to surprise several students, including some who had been watching the interaction with obvious anticipation. Emma realized that her refusal to be manipulated was creating cognitive dissonance for students, who had been taught to expect adult authority figures to cave under pressure. Zach finally intervened directly, apparently deciding that subtlety wasn't producing the desired results. "Ms. Rodriguez, I think you're being kind of unreasonable here. Kyle just wants help with his homework, and you're acting like he's trying to attack you or something. Maybe you're feeling stressed because you're new here." The comment was carefully crafted to make Emma appear paranoid while positioning Zach as the voice of reason. Emma recognized the gaslighting technique immediately, having seen similar psychological manipulation during her competitive fighting career when opponents tried to undermine her confidence before matches. "Zach," Emma replied evenly, "classroom. Policies exist for good reasons, and they apply equally to all students. If you're concerned about the availability of individual help, I encourage you to take advantage of the office hours that are specifically designed for that purpose." "But those office hours conflict with football practice," Brad complained, providing additional pressure from a third direction. "It's not fair that student athletes can't get the same help as everyone else just because we have other commitments that benefit the whole school." Emma realized she was facing a sophisticated argument designed to leverage institutional bias toward athletic programs. The suggestion that she was discriminating against student athletes by maintaining professional boundaries could be particularly damaging given the political realities of her situation. "Academic support is available to all students who choose to prioritize it," Emma said carefully. "I'm happy to work with anyone to find mutually acceptable times for additional help, but that assistance will always be provided in appropriate settings with proper supervision." The response was professionally unassailable, but clearly not what Zach's group had been hoping to provoke. Emma could see frustration building in their expressions as their carefully planned scenarios failed to produce the dramatic confrontations. They needed to build their case against her. The remainder of the class period passed in tense silence, with students working on their protein models while carefully avoiding the psychological battlefield that had developed between Emma and her tormentors. When the dismissal bell finally rang, most students packed quickly and left, but Emma noticed that several members of Zach's extended social circle remained behind, apparently waiting for something. "Ms. Rodriguez," Zach said as the last of the regular students departed, "I think we need to have a serious conversation about your attitude toward student athletes. You seem to have some kind of prejudice against us, and that's not really acceptable in a public school environment." Emma remained seated at her desk, noting that the students who had stayed behind were positioning themselves strategically around the room, potentially blocking her access to the door while creating the appearance of a spontaneous discussion rather than planned intimidation. "I don't have any prejudice against student athletes, Zach," Emma replied calmly. "I have consistent expectations for all students regardless of their extracurricular activities. Academic standards don't change based on athletic participation." "That's where you're wrong," Brad interjected, stepping closer to Emma's desk in a way that invaded her personal space. "Student athletes contribute to this school's reputation and funding in ways that regular students don't. We deserve consideration for the sacrifices we make and the benefits we bring to the community." Emma felt her martial arts training kicking in as her situational awareness heightened to combat levels. 5 male students had now positioned themselves around her classroom in a pattern that would allow them to control her movement while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. The configuration was too deliberate to be accidental. The success of athletic programs doesn't exempt participants from academic requirements, Emma said, subtly shifting her position to maintain clear sightlines to the door while keeping all potential threats in her peripheral vision. Every student in this school has the same right to education and the same responsibility to meet academic standards. Kyle moved to block her most direct path to the exit, his nervous energy replaced by something more confident and dangerous. You know what I think, Ms. Rodriguez? I think you're scared of us. I think you know you can't handle teaching in a real high school environment, and you're trying to hide your incompetence behind all these rules and policies. The comment was designed to provoke an emotional response that could be recorded and used as evidence of unprofessional behavior. Emma recognized the tactic immediately, drawing on years of tournament experience where opponents had tried to get inside her head through psychological manipulation. "I think this conversation is over," Emma said quietly, standing from her desk. With fluid grace that hinted at capabilities none of them suspected. "You gentlemen need to leave my classroom now so I can prepare for my next class." "Actually, I don't think we're done talking," Zach said, his voice carrying an edge of threat that confirmed Emma's worst fears about where this confrontation was heading. "You've been disrespecting us since your first day here, and it's time someone taught you how things really work at Lincoln High." Emma felt time slow around her as adrenaline flooded her system, the same sensation she had experienced in tournament finals, when critical decisions had to be made in split-second timing. 5. Against one odds that would terrify most people, but Emma Rodriguez wasn't most people. She was a third-degree black belt who had spent 8 years learning to handle exactly this type of situation. The question wasn't whether she could defend herself against 5 untrained teenagers. The question was whether she could do so without destroying her career and potentially facing criminal charges for assaulting minors, regardless of the circumstances that provoked her response. "Gentlemen," Emma said softly, her voice carrying a tone that made several of them instinctively step backward. "You have approximately 10 seconds to reconsider your current course of action. I strongly suggest you use that time wisely." Something in her tone penetrated the group's overconfidence, creating uncertainty where there had been predatory assurance. Zach's eyes narrowed as he tried to understand what had changed, why the frightened young teacher they had been tormenting suddenly seemed like someone entirely different. "Are you threatening us, Ms. Rodriguez?" Zach asked, but his voice lacked its previous confidence, "because if you are, that would be a really serious mistake. There are 5 of us here who would testify that you became violent and aggressive without any provocation." Emma smiled then, expression that held no warmth but conveyed absolute confidence in her ability to handle whatever they might attempt. "Not a threat, Zach. Just friendly advice from someone who cares about your continued good health and mobility." The comment was ambiguous enough to avoid legal problems while still communicating clearly that the dynamic had shifted dramatically. Emma was no longer playing defense against their campaign of harassment. She was preparing to take control of the situation in ways they couldn't possibly anticipate. Brad took a step forward, apparently misinterpreting her calm as continued. "Vulnerability. Look, lady, you need to understand that we run this school. Teachers come and go, but we're the ones who bring in the money and the recognition. You can either work with us or find out what happens to people who don't." Emma's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted slightly, a subtle adjustment that transformed her from educator to predator in the space of a heartbeat. The change was so profound that Kyle actually took an involuntary step backward, his nervous system recognizing danger even if his conscious mind couldn't identify its source. "Brad," Emma said conversationally, "I want you to think very carefully about your next words and actions, because what happens in the next 30 seconds is going to determine whether you walk out of here or get carried out. The choice is entirely yours." The threat was explicit enough to cross lines that could create legal problems, but Emma had calculated that her opponents were too invested in their current strategy to retreat without testing her resolve. They had come too far and revealed too much to back down now, which meant the confrontation was going to escalate regardless of what she said or did. Zach's face flushed with anger at her refusal to be intimidated, and Emma could see him making the mental transition from psychological manipulation to physical confrontation. "You know what? I think it's time someone taught you some respect for your betters." Emma felt the familiar calm that had always preceded her tournament victories, a crystalline clarity that slowed time and sharpened her perception to superhuman levels. 8 years of training had prepared her for exactly this moment, though she had never imagined it would come in a high school classroom against her own students. The real tragedy wasn't that violence was about to occur. The real tragedy was that it had become inevitable the moment these young men decided that their sense of entitlement was more important than basic human decency. Emma Rodriguez was about to remind them that some lessons could only be learned the hard way. The attack came exactly as Emma had anticipated it would, with Zach making the first move while his companions positioned themselves to claim she had been the aggressor. He lunged forward with the overconfident swagger of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions, his right hand reaching out to grab her shoulder in what would later be described as an attempt to calm down an hysterical teacher. Emma's response was instantaneous and devastating. 8 years of martial arts training compressed into a single fluid motion that redirected Zach's momentum while simultaneously destroying his balance. She stepped slightly to her left, caught his extended wrist with her right hand, and used his own forward motion to send him crashing into the desk behind her. The impact echoed through the classroom like a gunshot, followed by Zach's grunt of pain and surprise as he found himself sprawled across student desks with his arm twisted at an angle that suggested serious injury. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds, transforming the classroom dynamic so completely that the remaining 4 students stood frozen in shock. This wasn't the frightened young teacher they had been tormenting for weeks. This was someone entirely different. Someone whose calm competence in the face of physical threat spoke to capabilities they had never imagined. "Anyone else feeling aggressive today?" Emma asked conversationally, her voice carrying none of the stress or fear that should have accompanied a 5-on-1 confrontation. Her posture remained relaxed but ready, like a cat that had just demonstrated its ability to catch prey, but wasn't particularly interested in expending the energy to do so again. Brad recovered first from the group's collective shock, his face flushing with rage as he realized that their carefully planned intimidation had backfired spectacularly. "You crazy bitch," he snarled, stepping forward with his fists clenched. "You just assaulted a student. Your career is over." Emma tilted her head slightly, studying Brad with the same clinical interest she might show a particularly interesting biological specimen. "Is that really the narrative you want to go with, Brad? Because I'm pretty sure the security cameras in the hallway captured Zach initiating physical contact while you and your friends had me surrounded in my own classroom." The reminder about surveillance equipment caused visible uncertainty to flicker across several faces as the students realized their planned story might not hold up under scrutiny. Emma had deliberately mentioned the cameras to introduce doubt about their ability to control the narrative, even though she wasn't entirely certain what the recordings would actually show. Kyle took a nervous step backward, his earlier bravado evaporating as he began to grasp the full implications of what had just occurred. "This isn't what we planned," he whispered, though whether to himself or his companions wasn't clear. She wasn't supposed to know how to fight. Emma's smile widened slightly at the inadvertent admission of premeditation, confirming everything she had suspected about the coordinated nature of their harassment campaign. Actually, Kyle, there are quite a few things about me that you never bothered to learn. For instance, I've been training in martial arts since I was 12 years old. I hold a 3rd-degree black belt in Shotokan karate and have competed at the national level. She began moving slowly around the classroom, maintaining distance from her opponents while demonstrating the fluid grace that marked a true martial artist. The movement was hypnotic and threatening simultaneously, like watching a predator circle prey that had suddenly realized their position in the food chain. I've won 17 tournament championships, Emma continued in the same conversational tone, including 3 consecutive regional titles in the heavyweight division, despite being significantly smaller than most of my opponents. I've sparred with Olympic hopefuls and trained under some of the most respected senseis in North America. Zach groaned and tried to push himself upright, his left arm hanging at an awkward angle that suggested a dislocated shoulder. The pain was clearly intense, but Emma felt no sympathy for someone who had orchestrated weeks of psychological torture against her and potentially other teachers before her. The most important thing my training taught me, Emma said, her voice taking on a harder edge, is that bullies only understand one language. You can try reasoning with them, you can attempt to work within systems designed to address their behavior. You can even try to understand the psychological factors that drive their need to hurt others. But ultimately, bullies only stop when they encounter someone capable of making them stop. Brad's face had gone pale as the full scope of his miscalculation became apparent, but desperation made him attempt one final bluff. "You still can't prove that we did anything wrong," he said with false bravado. "It's our word against yours, and there are 4 of us who will testify that you attacked Zach without provocation." Emma reached into her blazer pocket and withdrew her smartphone, which had been recording video since the moment Zach's group had surrounded her desk. "Actually, Brad, I have the entire incident documented from my perspective, including the audio of your threats and Zach's explicit statement about teaching me respect for my betters." The blood drained from Brad's face as he realized that their carefully planned ambush had been turned against them. Emma had not only defended herself physically, but had also gathered the evidence needed to prove their conspiracy and her legitimate right to self-defense. "But here's what's really interesting about this situation," Emma continued, still moving with that predatory grace that kept all of them on edge. "You've just provided me with ironclad documentation of systematic harassment, conspiracy to assault, a teacher, and attempted intimidation. Any one of those charges would be enough to end your athletic careers and potentially result in criminal prosecution." Kyle was now visibly shaking, his nervous system finally processing the magnitude of their collective error in judgment. "What do you want from us?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Emma stopped moving and faced the group directly, her expression shifting from predatory to businesslike. "What I want, Kyle, is very simple. This harassment campaign ends immediately and permanently. You will treat me and every other teacher in this building with respect. You will complete your academic work to the best of your abilities, without expecting special treatment based on your athletic status." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle before continuing. "Most importantly, you will never again target a teacher for the kind of systematic psychological abuse you've been inflicting on me. Because if I hear about any of you pulling this garbage with another educator, I'll make sure everyone in this district knows exactly what kind of people you really are." Zach had finally managed to push himself into a sitting position, his face gray with pain and humiliation. His shoulder would require medical attention, and Emma knew that explaining the injury would force him to confront the reality of what had happened in ways that would be deeply uncomfortable. "As for you, Zach," Emma said, addressing the group's leader directly. I want you to understand something very clearly. Your father's position on the school board doesn't intimidate me. Your status as football captain means nothing to me. Your family's influence in this community has absolutely no bearing on how I'll respond if you ever threaten me again. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of absolute certainty. If you ever put your hands on me again, if you ever threaten me again, if you ever try to manipulate another teacher the way you've been manipulating me, I will end you. Not your career, not your reputation, you. Do I make myself clear? The threat was unambiguous and probably crossed several legal lines, but Emma calculated that Zach's group was too compromised to report her words without revealing their own criminal behavior. More importantly, she needed them to understand that the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. Zach nodded weakly, pain and shock having finally penetrated his arrogant facade enough to reveal the frightened teenager underneath. For the first time since she had met him, Emma saw genuine vulnerability in his eyes, the realization that actions could have consequences even for someone with his advantages. The classroom door opened suddenly, and Principal Morrison entered, with Coach Mitchell close behind, both of them responding to reports of shouting from Emma's room. The timing was almost perfect from Emma's perspective, providing official witnesses to the aftermath while ensuring that any medical treatment Zach required would be properly documented. What happened here? Principal Morrison demanded, taking in the scene of Zach's obvious injury and the defensive positioning of the other students around Emma. Zach and his friends surrounded me in my classroom and threatened me physically, Emma replied calmly, holding up her phone to indicate the recording. When Zach grabbed me, I defended myself using the minimum force necessary to prevent further assault. Principal Morrison's expression shifted rapidly between surprise, concern, and calculation as she processed the implications of Emma's statement. A teacher successfully defending herself against student assault would create significant administrative challenges, especially if the students involved were high-profile athletes. Coach Mitchell moved immediately to check on Zach's condition, his face darkening as he realized the extent of the injury. This looks like a dislocated shoulder, he said grimly. We need to get him to the hospital immediately. Emma watched the coach's reaction carefully, noting how quickly his concern focused on the injured student rather than the circumstances that had led to the confrontation. The institutional bias she had been fighting was fully on display, with adult authority figures more worried about athletic implications than teacher safety. I'll need to see that recording, Ms. Rodriguez, Principal Morrison said, extending her hand with obvious reluctance. We'll have to conduct a full investigation of this incident, including interviews with all the students involved. Emma handed over her phone willingly, confident that the video would support her version of events. Of course, Principal Morrison. I think you'll find that the recording clearly shows I acted in self-defense after being threatened and physically assaulted by students who had surrounded me in my own classroom. As Coach Mitchell helped Zach to his feet and prepared to escort him to receive medical attention, Emma addressed the injured student one final time. Zach, I hope you use this experience to reflect on your choices and their consequences. You have the potential to be a positive leader in this school, but that will require fundamental changes in how you treat other people. The comment was professionally appropriate and would sound reasonable to any administrator reviewing the incident, but Zach understood the deeper message. Emma Rodriguez had demonstrated that she was capable of backing up her words with action, and future confrontations would not end as favorably for him. After the injured student and coach left the room, Principal Morrison turned her attention to the remaining members of Zach's group. Gentlemen, you'll need to come with me to provide statements about what occurred here. I want detailed accounts from each of you about the events leading up to this incident. Emma watched the 4 remaining students file out of her classroom, noting the shell-shocked expressions that suggested they were still processing the complete failure of their planned intimidation. The psychological impact of seeing their leader defeated so decisively would ripple through the entire social hierarchy that had protected their behavior. "Ms. Rodriguez," Principal Morrison said once they were alone, "this is obviously a very serious situation that will require careful handling. I'll need you to write a detailed report of everything that happened, including the events leading up to today's incident." Emma nodded professionally, though she detected undertones in the principal's voice that suggested the administrative response might focus more on damage control than justice. "I'll have a comprehensive report on your desk by Monday morning, Principal Morrison. I think you'll find that today's incident was the culmination of weeks of systematic harassment that I attempted to address through proper channels." Principal Morrison's expression tightened slightly at the implication that administrative failures had contributed to the escalation. "We'll be reviewing all aspects of this situation, Ms. Rodriguez. In the meantime, I think it would be best if you took the rest of the day off to recover from what must have been a traumatic experience." Emma recognized the suggestion as an attempt to remove her from campus while administrators crafted their preferred narrative of events. However, she also understood that arguing about it would only create additional complications when her position was still potentially vulnerable. "I appreciate your concern, Principal Morrison," Emma replied diplomatically. "I'll use the time to complete my incident report and ensure that all relevant details are properly documented." After the principal left, Emma sat alone in her classroom, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. She had successfully defended herself against a coordinated assault, but the professional implications were far from certain. Even justified self-defense could be twisted into a narrative of teacher violence against students, especially when those students came from influential families. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted her thoughts, and Emma looked up to see Maria Santos standing hesitantly in the doorway. The student's expression showed a mixture of concern and admiration that suggested she had witnessed at least part of the confrontation. "Ms. Rodriguez," Maria said quietly, "are you okay?" We heard shouting and then saw Zach being taken to the nurse's office. Some students are saying he got hurt, but nobody seems to know exactly what happened. Emma gestured for Maria to come in, grateful for a friendly face after the intensity of the previous confrontation. "I'm fine, Maria, though I suspect there are going to be many different versions of today's event circulating through the school." Maria approached Emma's desk with obvious concern, her dark eyes reflecting genuine worry for her teacher's well-being. "Most of the students know that Zach and his friends have been targeting you since your first day here. A lot of us were hoping someone would finally stand up to them, but we were worried about what might happen to you if you tried." The comment revealed that Emma's situation had been far more visible to the student body than she had realized, with many teenagers recognizing the harassment campaign, even if they felt powerless to intervene. The knowledge was both comforting and troubling, suggesting widespread awareness of problems that administrators had chosen to ignore. What's important now is that everyone focuses on learning and treats each other with respect, Emma said carefully, aware that her comments to students could be scrutinized during any investigation. "I hope today's incident helps everyone understand that actions have consequences, regardless of who you are or what advantages you might think you have." Maria nodded solemnly, clearly understanding the deeper implications of Emma's words. "Some of us have been talking about forming a study group for students who want to focus on academics without worrying about harassment from certain athletes. Would you be willing to supervise something like that?" Emma felt a surge of hope at the suggestion, realizing that her stand against Zach's group might have created opportunities for positive change beyond just ending her own harassment. A supervised study group would provide academic support for motivated students while also creating a visible alternative to the toxic social dynamics that had dominated the school. "I think that's an excellent idea, Maria," Emma replied with genuine enthusiasm. "Academic achievement should be celebrated and supported, and any student who wants to prioritize learning deserves a safe environment in which to do so." Over the following weeks, the aftermath of the classroom confrontation played out in ways that surprised almost everyone involved. The investigation into the incident was thorough, but ultimately vindicated Emma's actions, with the video evidence clearly showing that she had acted in self-defense against an unprovoked assault. Zach's dislocated shoulder required several weeks of physical therapy, during which time his attitude underwent a remarkable transformation. The young man who returned to Emma's classroom was subdued and respectful, participating in lessons without disruption and completing assignments with genuine effort. His friends followed his lead, apparently having learned that their previous behavior carried risks they weren't prepared to accept. The change wasn't immediate or complete, but it was noticeable enough to create a more positive learning environment for everyone. More significantly, word of the incident spread throughout the district's faculty, providing hope for other teachers who had been struggling with similar harassment from entitled students. Several educators privately thanked Emma for taking a stand that had apparently emboldened administrators to take student misconduct more seriously. The study group that Maria had proposed became one of the most successful academic programs in the school's recent history, attracting dozens of students who had previously felt marginalized by the athletic social hierarchy. Emma found genuine satisfaction in mentoring young people who prioritized learning and mutual respect over social dominance and intimidation. Dr. Chen proved to be an invaluable ally during the administrative review process, providing documentation of the institutional patterns that had enabled Zach's behavior while supporting Emma's right to defend herself when those systems failed. Her intervention helped ensure that the investigation focused on the systemic issues rather than attempting to blame Emma for the confrontation. Perhaps most importantly, Emma discovered that her willingness to fight back when necessary had earned her a level of respect from both students and faculty that went far beyond what her academic credentials alone could have achieved. The quiet, young teacher who had seemed so vulnerable during her first weeks at Lincoln High had revealed herself to be someone capable of protecting herself and standing up for what was right. Coach Mitchell's attitude toward Emma remained frosty, but he no longer made dismissive comments about accommodating student athletes who brought prestige to the school. The coach seemed to understand that the old system of protecting favored students from consequences had been fundamentally challenged and could no longer be taken for granted. Principal Morrison's handling of the incident was professional, if not enthusiastic, with administrative policies being quietly updated to better protect teachers from systematic harassment. The changes weren't dramatic, but they represented acknowledgement that the previous approach had been inadequate. 6 months later, Emma received word that she had been selected for the district's Teacher of the Year award, recognizing both her academic excellence and her positive impact on school culture. The nomination letter specifically mentioned a role in creating a more respectful learning environment where all students could succeed regardless of their extracurricular activities. As Emma stood before the school board to accept the award, she noticed Zach Patterson sitting in the audience with his parents. The young man who had once terrorized her with systematic harassment now watched with what appeared to be genuine respect as she was honored for her contributions to education. After the ceremony, Zach approached her privately, his expression showing a maturity that had been completely absent during their earlier conflicts. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said quietly, "I wanted to apologize for how I treated you when you first arrived. At Lincoln High, I was wrong, and I'm grateful that you taught me some important lessons about respect and consequences." Emma studied his face carefully, looking for signs of manipulation or insincerity, but found only genuine remorse and growth. The arrogant teenager who had once threatened her career had apparently learned something valuable from their confrontation, though she suspected the lesson had been more about power and consequences than genuine empathy. "Thank you for saying that, Zach," Emma replied diplomatically. "I hope you'll use what you've learned to become a positive leader who helps other students rather than targeting them for harassment." Zach nodded seriously, and Emma could see that he was still processing the full implications of how dramatically his worldview had been challenged. The young man who had grown up believing that athletic ability and family influence made him untouchable had discovered that some people couldn't be intimidated or manipulated. As Emma drove home that evening with her Teacher of the Year plaque on the passenger seat, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The frightened young educator who had started the school year hoping only to survive had become someone capable of transforming an entire institutional culture through courage and competence. Her martial arts training had provided the physical skills necessary to defend herself when words and policies proved insufficient, but the real victory had been psychological. Emma Rodriguez had refused to be broken by systematic harassment, choosing instead to fight back in ways that ultimately benefited everyone in the school community. The lesson wasn't that violence was the answer to every problem, but rather that sometimes peaceful people had to be prepared to use force when bullies pushed situations beyond the reach of civilized solutions. Emma's willingness to defend herself had created space for positive change that might not have been possible through accommodation and appeasement. Years later, when other young teachers asked her for advice about handling difficult students and institutional pressure, Emma's response was always the same. Treat everyone with respect, maintain high standards, document everything, and never forget that some people only understand strength. The goal isn't to become a bully yourself, but to ensure that bullies understand you're not an easy target. Most importantly, she would tell them, remember that your students are watching how you handle challenges and adversity. The lessons you teach through your actions are often more powerful than anything written in curriculum guides. Sometimes the most important thing you can show young people is that decent people don't have to be victims, and that standing up for what's right is worth whatever temporary discomfort it might cause. Emma Rodriguez had learned that being a teacher meant more than just delivering academic content. It meant modeling courage, integrity, and the willingness to protect what mattered most, even when that protection required skills that had nothing to do with lesson plans or grading rubrics. The quiet woman who had once been targeted for harassment had become a force for positive change, proving that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are exactly what institutions need to rediscover their fundamental purpose and values. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.